Hello, my name's Ken Kinter. I'm an assistant professor at Rutgers University. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an introduction to crisis intervention. This is a field that's very near and dear to my heart. I've worked in it for about 20 of my 30 years in the mental health system. As always, my contact information is on the slide. If you have any questions or want any additional information, please don't hesitate to reach out. Before I get started, got to give credit where credit is due. Our mission at the State Hospital Psychiatric Rehabilitation Initiative has been made possible through the financial and other forms of support by the New Jersey Department of Health. Our goal at this initiative is to have better care and better conditions at New Jersey state psychiatric hospitals, and it is because of the support from the New Jersey Department of Health that our mission is made possible. We're very grateful for that. So now moving on, today we're going to start talking about crisis, various aspects of crisis, defining it, how you know when one's going on, and some ideas about how to intervene, and of course also about safety, which is a subject we can't skip. So a couple of the aspects of crisis is they tend to be unexpected. They create a lot of uncertainty and fear because there's a threat. There's a threat to physical safety or something that person holds valuable. One of the parts of crisis that I really I have to admit I enjoy it is whatever the person's been doing before they go into crisis isn't working, so they need to do something different. So as we'll talk about, crisis can be dangerous and kind of scary, but it can also be helpful in a strange way as well. It may help us make changes that we would not make ourselves any other way. So I love this quote: "Crisis is a process of transformation where the old system can no longer be maintained." So some characteristics of a crisis tend to be brief, tend to be short and intense. Crises can be caused internally or externally. At the time I'm recording this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 epidemic, so this makes a whole other level of sense now. Can be very disorienting. The whole idea of what people view the world and their own stability may have changed. Some people are very resilient and they manage through crises. Other people are sort of crisis prone, where they find themselves in these same emergencies over and over again. And as we talk about in this video and in other videos, these crises may be part of that learning curve moving forward. There is the potential for dangerousness. Part of the difficult part of crisis is that there is the potential for dangerousness. Can be a single incident, like one big incident, and I worked the 9/11 response. That's an example of a rather large incident. Or it can be the straws. And what I mean by the straws is many people that are in crisis, I've heard this so many times, where they talk about the straw that broke the camel's back. And these people may have never seen a camel in their life, but for some reason they all relate to that idea of enough little things can overburden anybody. And I agree with that. I believe that's definitely true. In fact, sometimes you may be handling the big things and then the little thing sets a person off. Crises happen to everyone. I don't know anyone who hasn't gone through some sort of crisis in their life, existential, spiritual, whatever. It gets brought to our door. And as I mentioned before, it's not always a bad thing. There tends to be very important lessons behind crisis. Crises are great, but very harsh teachers. So the stages of crisis: there's the vulnerable pre-crisis state that we might not even realize that we were in, the active stage where the crisis is actually going on, and then the stage that doesn't get nearly enough credit, the resolution stage. Very often after a crisis, people are so happy to get back to doing what they were doing before that the lesson gets lost. Crisis resolution is crisis prevention. It's a really important point. If it's closed out well, that can help prevent things from coming around in the future. So one thing that crises are very well known for is that they cause anxiety. People become very stressed during crisis states. So anxiety is helpful to a degree. When people have this mild or moderate anxiety going on, their energy level goes up, their level of focus and attention may go up, they have more energy. So these can be adaptive. Like there was a great study, and I should track it down, where if you look at the anxiety scale from 1 to 10, I believe that your ability to perform goes up until about 6 or 7, and then it falls off the cliff for 8, 9, or 10. So this is sort of a grouping those numbers here. So the mild state, heightened awareness and attention, person's energy level picks up a little bit. Moderate, you've got the heart rate, the blood pressure, you've got the body kicking in now. The person can still function and they're still focused, but the body's running in passing gear. Then we move into severe, and this is where we get into the 7 and the 8. all of a sudden that person's focus starts to zoom down into tunnel vision. And what they may focus on may not be pertinent. I remember one of the most common responses in 9/11 when people got home from New York City is they took a shower and they shaved and changed clothes. It was almost like they started the day over again. Now, I certainly understand the showering, you know, after what they had been through, but the whole idea of shaving again for a second time in about 12 hours, I thought was kind of interesting. More of a try to return to normalcy and paying attention to these specific details, almost to not pay attention to the bigger details. Focus on irrelevant details, as we mentioned. A lot of fear responses, a lot of concerns for people's safety, and what they call white knuckling. You know, that's, as you say, whenever you're at that period of strain, and you're physically and emotionally tense. Now we get into 9 and 10 on the 10-point scale. We get into panic. This person's in fight or flight mode. They're losing control, and their ability to deal with any of this stuff is diminished. They are all hopped up and all energized, but no focus. And at that point, the decisions they make may not be helping them, may actually be deepening the crisis at that point in time. So a great question, if you work in any of these helping professions, how would you know if the person you're working with was in crisis? How would you know? How are they different? How are their thoughts different? How are their feelings different? How's what they say and what they do and how they say it? How are all those different? Might be a good question to ask of yourself. That might be a good starting point when because you've been in a crisis state before, I'm sure I have as well. How are we different? And how do we change? So how can the people around us, especially the people who want to help us, how can they recognize this and intervene? We may not be in a position to say, excuse me, old chap, I do believe I'm in a bit of a crisis right now. I would love to have that sort of insight. I don't know why a pseudo-English accent is part of that, but we don't have the awareness at that moment. Very often, everyone around us knows we're in crisis before we are. So some of the outcomes, part of the reason why we have to pay so much attention to this, there is the potential to dangerousness, to self, to others, to property. Even if it isn't suicidal behavior, self-injurious behavior. There's a video like this on suicide that talks a lot more about that. Relapse. Big one. We're talking at the point where this is being recorded. We're in the middle of this quarantine business. It's been going on for about 7 weeks, and people are cooped up in their homes. And for some people, that insulates them from relapse, and for some people, that's a relapse trigger. A crisis can lead to other crises. You know, if one doesn't resolve the situation, it can pass this down the road to the next thing. Or if it's resolved poorly, it can bring it right around again sooner. Our goal, as always, is to restore at least the previous level of functioning. And I challenge, you and the people that you work with. How can you move it up a notch? How can you find something adaptive out of that crisis? At very least, you will learn something about how strong you are by a crisis. You don't learn how strong you are when times are good. You learn about how strong you are when the crisis is going on. And crisis has a funny way of bringing out the worst in people, but it also has a way of bringing out the best in people. And again, to go back to the 9/11 example, you have police officers, firemen, first responders charging into a building that is unsafe to save other people, often at their own destruction. And as we sit here right now, there are healthcare workers that are working with people knowing that they're infected and knowing that they're contagious, and they still go to work every day. So other aspects in crisis to look at are, you have a bunch of different things in play. You've got the person themselves, the client factors. You've got the factors of the staff around them, and I'm speaking specifically about, helping profession staff, or particularly in an inpatient facility where I work. Environmental factors, what aspects of that environment contribute to the crisis, and then the situational factor, that's the flashpoint. Any one of these can trigger the crisis to come, but very often they tend to work in combination. So you see this overlap here. If you want to see anything more about that, we have a video about safe wards, or you can go on safewards.net. They have a lot of great stuff about these different aspects of crisis. So environmental aspects, volume, space, how crowded is it? Is it a familiar place? Is it a safe place? Is it a friendly looking place, which psychiatric and correctional settings tend not to be? Is it organized, or is it kind of all hell breaking loose? What's the level of stimulation, noise, volume, light? And what aspects of that environment can you control? If it's a locked environment, that you can't control. However, things like the volume level, I'll give you a great example. In the state hospital where I work, we had this overhead paging system, and people were getting paged overhead like every 30 seconds. You could barely complete a coherent thought, and it kept the ambient volume up. So one of the CEOs at the hospital decided to stop all of those announcements. So the only announcements would be emergencies. So you could go hours without hearing that intercom system kick in. And I think that was much more of a friendly environment for the milieu. It took the volume down quite a bit. Violence and restraints did come down, and I think that was one, not the only, but one of the ingredients why. Staff issues, whether you have the same staff, whether there's consistency of staff. You would rather have consistent staff that a person has a relationship with than new people, even if those new people are more qualified or more experienced. You want to have staff that are supportive. One of the things we've noticed is that staff that are confrontational can very often bring on or provoke a crisis. And that they're okay, that they're emotionally present, that they're actually focused on their job at this point in time and not focused on other things or distracted by other things. The client factors, what is their history of violence? Are they someone who has potentially used violence to get what they want before? Or are they someone who becomes violent impulsively? Or is this someone who becomes violent because of things like addiction, personality disorder, psychosis, even something like what's referenced here, the negative worldview. Anyone who feels like the world is out to get me, everybody's out for himself, that's a person who's a lot closer to a crisis state because they're not going to reach out to other people. When they become overwhelmed, the world is overwhelmed because there's no support there. Also, people with intellectual disabilities may also be prone to the crises because of their the nature of their disability and cognitive impairment. Situational. Very often people go into crisis about the same thing over and over again. Working in screening for a long time, we had people who would come in every time there was a breakup. They would come in for being suicidal over and over and over again. It was actually kind of predictable after a while. One of the great questions to ask is, what does the person perceive could be or has been lost, and how important is that to them? Again, there are other videos where we talk about this a little bit more, but a really important piece, what they are viewing, their perception is much more important than the reality. Somebody might go into crisis because a piece of mail they were supposed to get on Wednesday didn't come Wednesday and didn't come Thursday, and so they freaked out on Thursday. And it's easy to say, oh, what was the mail? You know, get over it. They're waiting for a letter. They freaked out about a letter. What does it mean to them? What's the meaning? Because crises are framed by the person to a certain degree. So what is it about that that makes that crisis inducing? And then our challenges become, what are they going to do? What's their course of action? They may be thinking about something that's self-injurious or dangerous to others. What are other options that we can provide? And of course, part of what we're dealing with here is the emotions that are conjured up by that crisis. Very often fear, anger, which is very often fear flipped over, into an offensive position, sadness, shame. The emotions have to be dealt with before getting into the nuts and bolts and actual problem solving thing. And there's a video about 3 steps to safety, which addresses that. So when we're dealing with this person in crisis, what do we do? First, let's get the benefit of their experience. What have they done in the past? What's worked? How have they gotten through this? Whatever crises they've gone through in their life, they've survived them. They're in front of you now. Let's use that, whether it's internal or external. Let's play up what coping strategies they've used before and acknowledge and validate what they're going through. It's not, it was a letter, get over it. It's, you know what, I can see that you're frustrated, waiting for this thing. Tell me about the frustration. So ask about, validate the emotions. You don't try to put a lid on it. Like that genie's already out of the bottle. So let's talk to the genie and address it. What social supports do they have? What coping strategies do they already have? Before we start adding things and giving advice, what do they already have that's okay? Let's not do the it will be okay business because they don't feel okay at this point in time. Do not say, I know how you feel. Let these things go. In fact, it'd be a good idea if you took those out of your vocabulary altogether. First, let's talk about what their coping strategies are, what their supports are, how they've dealt with it themselves. And then let's start problem solving. What are the different things that they can do about this? And what are the costs and benefits of each of those options? We're pulling them out of the emotional mind a little bit back into the problem solving, decision-making aspects of this. Another very important piece to bring up is the best crisis intervention is prevention. So as in the video about suicide, we ask about suicide up front, ask about trauma up front, and ask about what crises they've been through up front. In the beginning, when it's not currently going on, is a good time to get at it and say, what are the things that trigger you, and what are the major low points in your life. You're also going to be working on goals and all of the positive stuff, but we got to hit both sides of this. What do you want to accomplish? What are your strengths? What are all that positive stuff that's going to help you get where you go? And then what are all these things that may show up in terms of barriers as well? You want that. That way you can plug the person back into their goals again when they're in crisis, but you also have some tips about how they look when they're in crisis, what's gotten them into crisis, and what are some of the ways they've gotten out of it. So you start paving this road as soon as you meet that person and you start building that relationship. And just by building that relationship, you prepare yourself to be part of the solution when that thing comes down, because it will come down. Crisis is inevitable. So just to wrap this up, crises are sudden, intense situations where the old way of functioning just doesn't get it done anymore. Crises produce a lot of anxiety. They can be dangerous, but they're also opportunities. The anxiety that people feel in a crisis is helpful in small and moderate amounts, but it becomes destructive when it goes off the top end. So it's okay for that person to be somewhat anxious. It's okay for that person to be moderately anxious. But once it goes over that 7-8 stage, then it ceases to be productive anymore. Crises are introduced by many aspects, including themselves, the staff, environmental, situational aspects. The more you know about crisis, the better off you are. And good crisis intervention starts with crisis prevention, which should be planned literally at intake the first time you see people. This is the only time you're ever going to hear me quote Dr. Phil, and that is, a crisis is no time to develop a crisis plan. The crisis plan should be constructed, written, out there, and ready to go when the crisis actually shows up. It's kind of like a fire escape plan. When the house is on fire, you don't think about the best way to leave the house and how you should do it. You already have the plan together and you're just putting it in action. So I wanted to thank Annette Bax and Fran Ulrich, who made the original version of this PowerPoint presentation. You can also see some of the other resources, and this is where some of the data came from in here. As I mentioned before, we have other videos that are related to this about suicide, 3 steps to safety, many other things in this area, safe words, that may be able to help you out as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Take care, and hopefully see you again soon.